Fairfield County, Connecticut, December 25th. A daughter is losing her future. The winter air rattles the kitchen door, but there are no carols, only the cold blue pulse of Christmas lights against the frosted glass. My name is Teresa Scott, and I am watching my father sharpen a carving knife as he prepares to trade my life savings for my brother's ego. They think I am just a shadow in their legacy, but they don't know who is waiting in the storm. When the man who owns my father's paycheck steps into the light, will they realize betrayal has a price? Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The snow fell hard against the Connecticut hills. It was a heavy, wet snow that clung to the dark limbs of the hemlocks and turned the long, winding driveway into a white river. I watched it from the kitchen window. The glass was fogged at the edges, frosted with the breath of the house, but through the clear center I could see the lights my father had strung across the eaves. They were large, incandescent bulbs, blue and white, and they pulsed with a mechanical, aggressive rhythm. It was a performative display. It was the kind of display that told the neighbors in the valley that the Scotts were home, and that the Scotts were doing well even if the wind was trying to tear the shingles from the roof. Inside the house was too warm. The radiator in the kitchen hissed and clanked like a dying engine, and the heavy commercial stove had been running since noon. I opened the oven door. The heat hit my face like a physical weight, dry and searing. It smelled of sage and rendered fat and the sharp, tinny scent of the roasting pan. The turkey was a 24-pound bird, its skin pale and stretched tight across the drumsticks. I took the glass baster and drew up the hot amber juices. They sizzled as I poured them over the breast. My arms ached from the weight of the pan and the hours of standing. I had been on my feet since 6 a.m, peeling, chopping, and stirring. That was my place in this house. I was the reliable one. I was the daughter who ensured the mechanics of the holiday stayed hidden so the others could sit by the fire and talk of larger things. My mother, Elena, stepped into the kitchen. She moved with a silent, practiced grace. She was wearing a silk blouse the color of expensive cream and a string of pearls that looked cold and hard against her throat. Her hair was pulled back into a knot that showed no stray strands. She did not look at me. She looked at the stovetop. She took a silver spoon from the drawer and dipped it into the pot of mashed potatoes. She tasted them, her eyes narrowing as she chewed. "They need more salt, Teresa," she said. Her voice was flat and precise. "And they are still too lumpy. You have to be aggressive with the masher. You cannot be timid with food, or people will think you are timid in life." I did not say that my wrists were sore. I did not say that she had not touched a vegetable all day. I took the salt cellar and shook a fine white dust over the steam. I picked up the heavy wire masher and pushed down into the starch. The steam rose and dampened my hair, sticking it to my forehead. She watched me for a moment longer, her silence a form of critique before she turned and walked back toward the living room. She lived in a world of surfaces, and I was the one who had to keep them polished. I could hear them in the living room. My father Richard and my brother Leo. The sound of their laughter was loud and rhythmic, cutting through the muffled quiet of the snow. It was the sound of men who were comfortable with their own importance. I heard the clink of ice against heavy crystal. They were drinking the Macallan. It was the 18-year-old bottle my father kept in the mahogany sideboard reserved for special occasions or for whenever Leo came home from the city. Leo was 32 years older than me, and he carried the air of a man who had already conquered things he hadn't yet started. He had a way of standing chest out, heels planted, that claimed the space around him. He talked about venture capital and market disruptions and leveraging synergies in a voice that was a perfect, practiced imitation of our father's. Richard called him the future of the Scott name. I was just Teresa. I was the one who lived 20 minutes away and checked on the house when they went to Florida. I was the one who remembered the anniversaries and handled the dry cleaning and made sure the lawn was mowed. In the living room, they were talking about legacy. It was a word my father liked to use when he had enough scotch in him. He was a vice president at a regional logistics firm, and he saw his life as a series of strategic maneuvers. Leo was his greatest maneuver. I went to the doorway and looked at them. The fire was roaring in the hearth built with birch logs that popped and threw orange sparks against the black iron screen. Richard was leaning back in his leather chair, his face flushed a deep red from the heat and the alcohol. Leo was standing by the mantel, gesturing with his glass as he described a new software idea. He looked like a catalog model for a life he couldn't yet afford on his own. They didn't see me standing there. I was part of the architecture of the house, as familiar and overlooked as the crown molding. I thought about Julian. He was supposed to be here by now. He had called an hour ago from the road, his voice thin and crackling over the Bluetooth. He told me the Merritt Parkway was a parking lot of ice and red brake lights. He told me he loved me, and to save him some of the dark meat. Julian was a quiet man, an architect who spent more time thinking about the structural integrity of a beam than the color of the paint. My parents didn't understand him. When I told them we were engaged, my mother had asked if he planned on opening his own firm soon, or if he was content being an employee. When I said he liked the work he was doing, she had looked at him as if he were a piece of unfinished furniture. Richard thought Julian was fine, which was his word for a man who didn't take up enough space in a room. They thought he was middle management material. They didn't know the way he looked at a landscape and saw the hidden geometry of the earth. They didn't know the strength in his hands. To them, we were a quiet couple who would have a quiet, unremarkable life, and that made us secondary to the grand narrative of Leo's rise. I went back to the kitchen and began to set the dining table. The silver was heavy and cold. It was the Reed and Barton set, and it had to be polished until you could see the whites of your own eyes in the curve of the spoons. I laid out the linens. They were Irish lace, stiff with starch and smelling of cedar. I moved with a steady, rhythmic pace. I placed the wine glasses, 3 for each setting, ensuring the stems were aligned perfectly. The kitchen door rattled in its frame. The wind was picking up a northern wind that was dry and biting. It whistled through the weather stripping, and I felt the chill hit my ankles. I looked at the kitchen clock. It was nearly 7. The dinner was ready. The stage was set. I felt a strange hollow pressure in my chest. It was the feeling of a long race nearly finished, or a storm that had been building for 3 days and was finally about to break. I wiped my hands on my apron and untied the strings. I smoothed my dress. It was a simple navy wool, modest and functional. It was a dress for a daughter who wanted to be helpful. I walked back into the living room. The scotch was lower in the bottle now, the amber liquid catching the light of the fire. The laughter had grown sharper, more jagged. Richard looked at me, his eyes slightly clouded. "Is it time?" he asked. He did not wait for my answer. He stood up and straightened his silk vest, pulling it down over his stomach. "Leo, finish your drink," he said. "We have a lot to celebrate tonight, more than Teresa knows." Leo grinned. It was a wide, teeth-heavy grin that didn't reach his eyes. He slapped our father on the back with a heavy hand. "It's going to be a big year, Dad," he said. "The biggest one yet." I stood there in the shadow of the hallway watching them. I felt the weight of the house and the weight of the expectations that had been piled on my shoulders for 28 years. I thought about the $250,000 that my grandmother had left for me in a trust money meant for my wedding, for my house, for my future. I thought about the June wedding Julian and I were planning with the white peonies and the garden lights. I did not know that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one sitting at the head of the table. I just knew that the silver was polished, the turkey was basted, and the door was rattling. I went to the window one last time and wiped away the fog. The blue and white lights were still blinking in the dark. They were bright and they were cold, and they did not care about the snow. The dining room was large and the walls were covered in a heavy textured paper that seemed to absorb the light from the chandelier. We sat at the long oak table. I had placed the turkey at the center, its steam rising in a thin, pale column toward the ceiling. Richard sat at the head of the table. He carved the meat with a long, thin knife that he sharpened with a rhythmic steel rasp. The sound was metallic and cold. Leo sat across from me, his sleeves rolled up just enough to show his watch, a heavy piece of gold and glass that caught the reflections of the candles. Elena sat at the other end, her hands resting on the white linen, her rings catching the light. The wine was a Cabernet from a valley in California that Richard liked to talk about. It was dark, and it was thick in the glass. Richard filled his glass first, then Leo's, then mine. He did not fill Julian's empty glass. The chair next to me remained vacant, a gap in the symmetry of the table. The snow continued to beat against the large bay window behind my father, a white darkness that made the room feel like a ship at sea. We began to eat. The turkey was moist, and the gravy was rich, but the air in the room was thin. For a long time, the only sounds were the scraping of silver against china and the muffled roar of the wind in the chimney. Richard cleared his throat and stood up. He held his glass by the stem, the red wine swaying slightly. He looked at Leo, then at Elena, and finally briefly at me. He had the face of a man who was used to giving orders and having them followed without question. He looked at the fire and then back at the table. "We are a family that understands the value of a name," he began. His voice was deep and had the resonant quality of a man who spoke in boardrooms. "A name is not just something you are born with. It is a vessel. It is a thing you build with effort and with foresight. My father built this life, and I have expanded it. Now it is time to look at the next generation. It is time to think about legacy." I felt a small warm spark of hope in my chest. I thought he was going to talk about the wedding. Julian and I had been engaged for a year. We had found the venue, a stone barn in the valley, and we had sent the save the dates. The $250,000 trust that my grandmother had left was the foundation of everything. It was the money my father managed as the trustee, the money intended for my start in life, my wedding, and the down payment on the house Julian and I wanted to build. I looked at Richard, and I waited for him to say my name. "Legacy is not about parties," Richard said, and his voice went harder. "It is not about a single day of celebration. It is about the long-term health of the Scott name. I have spent the last few months reviewing our assets and our opportunities. Leo has a vision. He has a plan for an AI-driven logistics platform that will revolutionize the way we move goods in this country. It is a bold move. It is the kind of move that requires capital, significant capital." He paused and took a slow sip of his wine. "I have decided to reallocate the funds from your grandmother's trust, Teresa. The $250,000. It will be the seed money for Leo's startup. It will be the engine of his success. And because he is a Scott, it will be the engine of our family's future." He sat down and picked up his fork as if he had just finished discussing the weather. He began to eat a piece of turkey, chewing slowly and with purpose. The silence that followed was heavy, and it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I felt the blood recede from my face. I looked at Leo. He was not looking at me. He was staring at his plate, a small, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I looked at my mother. She was watching me, her expression neutral and frozen like a portrait in a museum. "But Dad," I said. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, small and distant. "That was Grandmother's gift to me. It's for the wedding in June. We've already signed the contracts. I've paid the deposits with my own savings, thinking the trust would cover the rest. We have the caterer, the florist, the band. It's all settled." Richard didn't look up from his plate. "Contracts can be broken, Teresa. Deposits can be forfeited. It's a small price to pay for the greater good of the family. A wedding is a vanity project. It's a day of expensive flowers and bad music. It doesn't produce anything. It doesn't build a legacy. Leo's business is a real venture. It's an investment in a future that bears our name." "You can't just take it," I said. I felt the resilience I had built over years of being the reliable daughter begin to sharpen into a cold, hard edge. I was the one who had stayed close. I was the one who had cared for the family's needs while Leo was away playing at being a mogul. I worked for that money too in my own way. I earned the right to that future. Elena leaned forward, then her pearls clinking against the edge of her plate. "Don't be dramatic, Teresa," she said. Her voice was like a thin blade of ice. "You're being selfish. You're thinking about a party when your brother is trying to build a career. You have to understand your place in the structure. You aren't the star of this family. Leo is the one who will carry us forward. You are a Scott daughter, and that means supporting the Scott son. A courthouse wedding is more your speed anyway. You were never meant for the grand displays. You don't have the temperament for it. It would be a waste of $250,000 to watch you walk down an aisle for 20 minutes. Richard nodded in agreement. "Your mother is right," he said. "Have a quiet ceremony. Go to the courthouse, have a nice lunch, and get on with it. Julian is a simple man. I'm sure he doesn't care for the theatrics either. He's middle management, Teresa. He should be used to making do with less. This money belongs where it can grow, not where it will be buried in a garden party." He looked at Leo and smiled. "To the future," he said, raising his glass again. Leo raised his glass too. "To the future," he repeated. They clinked their glasses together. The sound was sharp and final, like a gavel hitting a block. I sat there and I looked at my plate. The food was still there, the turkey and the potatoes and the green beans with the almonds. I picked up my fork and I took a bite of the turkey. It was dry now. It tasted like ash and iron. I chewed it and I swallowed it, but it felt like I was swallowing stones. I looked at the empty chair beside me. I thought about Julian out there in the snow, fighting the wind and the ice to get here to be with a family that viewed him as an afterthought. I thought about the house we had imagined, the one with the large windows and the wooden beams, the one he had stayed up late at night designing for us. I realized then that I was a secondary character in their lives. I was a utility. I was the one who kept the house running so they could dream of legacies that didn't include me. The American values of community and family they preached were a one-way street. They wanted my loyalty, but they offered me none. They wanted my sacrifice, but they would not give an inch of their own ambition. I felt the personal freedom I had always taken for granted begin to feel like a distant, unreachable shore. I realized I was alone at this table, even though I was surrounded by my own blood. The room felt colder than the world outside. The fire was still burning in the hearth, but it provided no warmth. It was just light and noise. I put my fork down. I did not want to eat anymore. I wanted the night to be over, but the night was just beginning. The snow was still falling, and the wind was still howling, and the $250,000 was gone, and with it, the life I thought I was building. I looked at my father, and I saw him for the first time. He was just a man in a vest with a red face and a glass of wine, and he was very small. The knock came 3 times. It was a heavy, deliberate sound that cut through the silence of the dining room. It was not the frantic rapping of a neighbor or the light touch of a delivery man. It was the sound of iron hitting oak. My father looked at the door and then at his watch. He frowned. The snow was a wall of white outside the window, and no one should have been on the roads. He stood up and straightened his vest. He walked toward the foyer, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. I sat at the table and watched the wine in my glass. It was still and dark. I heard the heavy latch of the front door click open. A gust of cold air swept into the house, smelling of wet wool and the frozen pine of the woods. I heard voices. They were low and muffled by the heavy drapes of the dining room archway. I recognized the deep, resonant tone of a man who was used to being heard. My mother stood up. She smoothed her hair and adjusted her pearls. She had a look on her face that she only used for people who had money or power. It was a look of sharp, calculated interest. I remained in my chair. I felt a strange coldness in my hands. Richard returned to the dining room a moment later. He was followed by a man in a long, dark wool coat. The man was tall, and his hair was silver, cut short and neat. He moved with a quiet authority that made the room feel smaller. This was Arthur. I had met him only once before at a quiet dinner in the city with Julian. He had been kind and observant, but he had said little about his work or his life. Julian had told me his father was a consultant who traveled a lot. I had never seen him in a house like this. He looked at me, and his eyes were clear and steady. He did not look at the table or the decorations. He looked at me. "Teresa," he said. His voice was calm. "Julian is just behind me. He stopped to help a car out of a ditch a mile back. He should be here soon. He was worried about you. He told me the weather was getting worse." My father stepped forward, his face shifting into a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Arthur," he said, extending a hand. "We didn't expect you. Please take off your coat. Stay for a drink. We were just celebrating some big news for the family." He spoke with a forced heartiness that made me feel sick. He didn't know Arthur. He only knew that Arthur looked like the kind of man who should be catered to. Arthur did not move toward the coat closet. He stood in the entryway of the dining room. "I heard what you said, Richard," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that stopped the air in the room. I was standing in the foyer and the door was not yet closed. "I heard you tell your daughter to stop crying and be a team player. I heard you tell her that her wedding was a vanity project and that her brother was the only legacy worth your time." He looked at my mother. "And I heard you say she wasn't the star of this family." My mother turned a shade of pale that matched the snow outside. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked at Arthur and then at the floor. Richard laughed, a short, nervous sound. "Oh, that was just family talk, Arthur. You know how it is. Emotions run high on Christmas. We're just making some strategic decisions for Leo's future. It's a business move, a legacy move." He gestured toward Leo, who was still sitting at the table looking suddenly very small in his expensive watch. Arthur walked into the room. He did not look at Richard. He walked to me and put a hand on my shoulder. It was a firm, steady weight. It felt like the first honest thing in the house. "You have a good heart, Teresa," he said. "Julian told me you were the one who held things together. I see now what he meant." He looked back at my father. "Richard, I've spent my life looking at people. I've built a career on understanding what makes a foundation strong and what makes it rot. I've seen men like you before. You think legacy is a bank account. You think power is the ability to take from those who trust you. You're wrong." Richard's face went from red to a mottled purple. "Now look here, Arthur," he said. "I don't know who you think you are coming into my house and talking to me like this. I'm a vice president at Hadley Logistics. I've worked 30 years to build this life. My son is starting a firm that will change the industry. We just secured a $250,000 investment tonight. We are doing just fine." Arthur's expression did not change. It was as if he were looking at a bug on a windshield. "A $250,000 investment," he said. "And where exactly did that capital come from?" Richard straightened his shoulders. "It was a family trust, reallocated for a better return. It's sound business." Arthur let out a long, slow breath. He turned to me. "Is that the money your grandmother left for you, Teresa? The money for your wedding and your home?" I nodded. I couldn't speak. I felt the tears finally starting to burn in my eyes, but I did not let them fall. I stayed stoic. I stayed quiet. "Yes," I said. Arthur looked back at Richard. "You stole from your daughter to fund a whim for a son who hasn't worked a day in his life. You took her future and handed it to a boy who drinks your scotch and wears your clothes. You did it on Christmas, and you did it because you think she has nowhere else to go." Richard stepped toward him, his fists clenched. "You get out of my house," he spat. "You're just the father of some middle manager kid my daughter is dating. You have no right to speak to me about my business or my family. I don't care how nice your coat is. Get out." Arthur reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a small leather-bound wallet. He opened it and set a card on the table. It slid across the wood and stopped in front of Richard. "I am Arthur Hadley," he said. "My father founded Hadley Logistics. I am the chairman of the board of the firm that acquired your employer 3 weeks ago. I don't usually involve myself in the regional staffing, but I made an exception for this branch. I wanted to see the man who was managing our Connecticut operations. I wanted to see if he was the kind of man who understood the value of loyalty and integrity. I wanted to see the family that Julian was marrying into." The room went completely silent. The only sound was the wind rattling the glass in the bay window. My father looked at the card. He didn't pick it up. He just looked at it. His mouth hung open slightly. Leo's face was white. He looked like he wanted to vanish into the chair. Elena was clutching her pearls so hard I thought the string would snap. Arthur looked at them all and his eyes were like chips of blue ice. "I've seen enough," he said. "I thank you for showing me your true colors. It saves a lot of time in the vetting process." He turned to me. "Teresa Julian is in the driveway. He's waiting in the car. I bought a house in the Berkshires last month. It's a mansion, really. Too big for an old man like me. I was going to give you and Julian the deed on your wedding day, but I think you should move in tonight. My driver is outside. He will help you with whatever you need to take. But if I were you, I would take very little from this house. It's full of things that don't belong to you anymore." I stood up. I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I looked at my father. He looked broken. He looked like a man who had built a house of cards and had finally felt the wind. He tried to speak, but Arthur cut him off. And Richard Arthur said, "I'll be in the office on Monday. We're looking for staff to lay off as we restructure. We're looking for the fat. We're looking for the people who don't add value to the culture of the company. I think I know exactly where to start." Arthur turned and walked toward the foyer. I didn't look back. I didn't say goodbye. I walked out of the dining room past the silver and the lace and the 24-pound turkey that was cooling on the table. I walked into the cold night and the snow, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was walking home. Arthur reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. He unzipped it slowly. The sound of the zipper was sharp in the quiet room. He took out a set of keys. They were heavy and made of bright brass attached to a silver ring that caught the light of the chandelier. He held them out to me. I took them. They were cold from the wind that had followed him inside. "These are for the estate in the Berkshires," he said. "It is a good house. It is built of stone and oak and it sits on a ridge that looks toward the west. It has a library and a kitchen that Julian will like. I was going to wait for the wedding, but a house is a place for shelter, and it seems you need shelter from this storm." I looked at the keys in my palm. They felt like a heavy weight and a great lightness all at once. I did not say thank you yet. The word felt too small for the air in the room. I looked at my father. He was staring at the keys as if they were a weapon. His face was no longer purple. It was the color of old parchment. He looked at the card on the table, and then at Arthur. The silence was the kind of silence that happens after a tree falls in the woods. It was absolute and it was heavy. Richard cleared his throat. It was a wet, rattling sound. He stood up straighter, trying to reclaim some piece of the man he had been 10 minutes ago. He adjusted his silk vest. "Arthur," he said. His voice was thin. It lacked the resonance it had possessed when he was talking about legacy. "There has been a misunderstanding. A grave misunderstanding. You have to understand the pressures of a man in my position. The logistics industry is changing. It is a hard business. I have given 30 years to Hadley Logistics. I have been a loyal soldier. I was only trying to ensure that my son had a foothold. I was thinking of the family." He reached out a hand toward the card on the table, but he did not touch it. "I am a vice president. I am a valuable asset to the firm. Surely the board understands the need for strong leadership during an acquisition." He was pleading now. The stoicism he had demanded of me was nowhere to be found in him. He was a man looking for a handhold on a slippery slope. He looked at Arthur with eyes that were wide and desperate. Arthur did not look at the hand. He did not look at the vest. He looked at the window where the snow was still beating against the glass. "I know your record, Richard," he said. "I have read the files. I know the margins of the Connecticut branch. They are thin. They have been thin for 3 years. I came here tonight to see if the thinness was in the market or in the man. I found the answer in the way you spoke to your daughter. A man who will steal from his own blood to satisfy his ego is not a man who can be trusted with the assets of a global firm. Loyalty is not a word you use to get what you want. It is a thing you live." He turned his gaze back to my father. "We signed the final papers on the acquisition last Friday. The restructuring begins on Monday morning. My firm does not keep fat on the bone. We are looking for efficiency. We are looking for leaders who understand that a company is built on the strength of its people, not the height of its walls. I have already drafted the initial list for the layoffs. I was waiting for tonight to see if I should strike one name from it. Richard sank back into his chair. The wood creaked under his weight. He looked at Leo. Leo was staring at the half-eaten turkey on his plate. The gold watch on Leo's wrist looked gaudy now, a shiny toy in a room full of real consequences. The $250,000 that Richard had promised him was suddenly a ghost. It was money stolen from a daughter by a father who no longer had a salary to protect it. If the money was used for the startup, and the startup failed, there would be no safety net. There would be no vice president's salary to bridge the gap. There would be no Scott legacy. There would only be a family in a suburban house with too many Christmas lights and no way to pay the electric bill. Leo looked up at me. His eyes were not satisfied anymore. They were full of a sudden sharp fear. "Teresa," he said. He didn't finish the thought. He didn't have to. He was realizing that the foundation of his ambition had been built on a theft that had now cost him everything. He looked at Arthur and then back at me as if I could somehow fix the air in the room. The realization hit my mother next. She had been standing by the sideboard, her hand resting on the silver tea service. She let her hand drop. She looked at Richard, and for the first time in my life, I saw her look at him with something that wasn't admiration or calculation. She looked at him with a cold, clear pity. She realized that the pearls and the silk and the status she had cultivated were tied to a man who had just dismantled his own life in front of a billionaire. She looked at me and I saw her mouth move, but she said nothing. She was a woman who lived for the star of the family, and she had just watched that star go out. The room was warm, but they were all shivering. The fire was still throwing orange light against the walls, but it looked like a funeral pyre. The American dream they had been performing, the one of constant ascent and untouchable success, had collapsed. They had traded resilience for greed and community for ego, and they were left with nothing but the remnants of a dinner they couldn't finish. Arthur looked at me. "Julian is at the door," he said. I went to the foyer. Julian was there. He was covered in snow. His coat was dusted with white and his face was red from the wind. He looked at me and he didn't have to ask. He saw the keys in my hand. He saw the look in my eyes. He walked past me into the dining room. He didn't look at Richard or Elena. He looked at Arthur. "Is it done?" he asked. "It is done," Arthur said. Julian turned to me. He took my hand. His hand was cold, but his grip was steady. "Let's go, Teresa," he said. "We have a long drive ahead of us." I looked back at the dining room one last time. My father was sitting with his head in his hands. My mother was staring at the bay window. Leo was drinking what was left of the scotch, but he was doing it with a shaking hand. They looked like strangers to me. They looked like people I had met once a long time ago and had nothing left to say to. The house was full of things, but it was empty of everything else. I walked up the stairs. The carpet was thick and soft under my feet. I went into my old room. It was a room of a girl who wanted to please. I took a single suitcase from the closet. I did not pack the jewelry they had given me. I did not pack the expensive dresses. I packed my journals. I packed a sweater Julian had given me. I packed a photograph of my grandmother. She was standing in a garden and she was smiling. She was the one who had left the money, and she was the one who would have understood why I was leaving it behind. I closed the suitcase. The latch clicked shut. It was a clean sound. It was the sound of a period at the end of a long, difficult sentence. I walked back down the stairs. The house felt smaller with every step I took. The ceilings felt lower. The air felt thinner. I reached the foyer and Arthur was waiting by the door. He took my suitcase. Richard looked up as I passed the dining room door. "Teresa," he said. His voice was a whisper. "Wait." I didn't wait. I didn't look. I walked out into the snow. The wind hit me, and it was cold and it was sharp, but it was clean. It didn't smell like turkey or wood smoke or desperation. It smelled like the sky. Julian was holding the car door open. The engine was humming a low, steady sound that promised movement. I got into the seat. Arthur got into the back. The driver was a man in a dark cap who didn't say a word. He put the car in gear and we began to move down the long, winding driveway. I looked back at the house. The blue and white lights were still pulsing against the dark. They were bright and they were hollow. We turned onto the main road and the house disappeared behind a stand of hemlocks. The snow was falling in great silent sheets. I looked at the keys in my hand. I looked at Julian. He was watching the road. He was a simple man, my father had said. He was a man who knew how to build things that lasted. I closed my eyes, and I felt the car pull us away from the life I had known and toward the one I had earned. The car moved steadily through the dark. The tires made a soft, wet sound as they cut through the slush on the asphalt. Inside, the air was warm, and it smelled of expensive leather and the faint, clean scent of Julian's cedar aftershave. I sat in the front seat and watched the windshield wipers. They moved back and forth with a rhythmic, hypnotic click, left and right, clearing the white flakes that tried to cling to the glass. I did not look back at the house after we cleared the driveway. I did not need to see the blue and white lights anymore. I did not need to see the silhouette of my father through the bay window or the way my mother stood in the foyer. I had not screamed at them. I had not thrown the Cabernet against the white wallpaper. I had not given them the satisfaction of a scene. A scene is a form of engagement, and I was finished engaging. I had packed the one suitcase, and I had left the rest. The expensive jewelry, the designer coats, the furniture I had picked out for a room that was no longer mine, it was all just wood and fabric and stone. It was heavy, and I wanted to be light. I had walked out with my journals and my memories and the keys to a house I had never seen, and that was enough. I felt the weight of the last 10 years lifting off my chest rib by rib. It was a physical sensation like a fever breaking in the middle of the night. I looked at my hands in the glow of the dashboard. They were steady. They did not shake. Julian reached over and covered my hand with his. He did not say anything. He didn't have to. He was a man who understood that silence was a place where you could rest. Arthur sat in the back, his presence a quiet, formidable shadow. He was looking out the side window at the passing trees. He had saved me, but he had done it by simply showing me what was already there. He had pulled back the curtain on the Scott legacy and revealed the rot behind the paint. I thought about the $250,000, the money my grandmother had intended for my happiness. It was gone. It was in a bank account now that would likely be drained by Leo's failures or seized by the creditors that would come for my father when the salary stopped. I thought about the lawyers I could hire. I thought about the years of litigation, the depositions in gray offices, the bitterness of a courtroom battle against my own blood. I could fight for it. I could spend my life trying to get back what they had stolen. But I knew then with a clarity that was as cold as the ice on the road that I would not. To sue them would be to stay tied to them. It would be a cord that kept me anchored to the suburban house and the heavy oak table and the lies we told each other over turkey and scotch. My time was worth more than $250,000. My peace was a currency they could not understand. I had the resilience to start over. I had the skills Julian and I possessed, the quiet strength of our work, and the freedom of a clean break. Personal freedom is not the ability to buy things. It is the ability to walk away from things that no longer serve the truth. I chose the freedom. I chose the silence. The money was just paper and ink. My life was a series of mornings that I could now face without the weight of their expectations. I felt a strange sense of pity for Leo. He had the money, but he was trapped in a cycle of needing a father's approval and a legacy he didn't earn. He was a prisoner of the $250,000. I was free of it. I was the one who had won because I was the one who was moving forward. We began the climb into the Berkshires. The road wound upward, and the trees became thicker, their branches heavy with the fresh snow. The world was white and black and silver. We passed small towns where the streetlights were lonely glows in the storm. Everything looked quiet. Everything looked still. I thought about the estate Arthur had mentioned, a house of stone and oak, a place where the wind would howl against the walls, but the foundation would not move. It was a gift, but it was also a responsibility. It was a place to build something new, a place where Julian could design his buildings and I could write my own story, one that didn't involve basting turkeys for people who didn't see me. I thought about the American value of the frontier, the idea that you could always head west, always find a new ridge, always start again. I was heading north, but the feeling was the same. The past was a country I had emigrated from. I didn't speak the language anymore. Julian squeezed my hand. "We're almost there," he said. His voice was low, and it held a promise of rest. I nodded. I looked out the window. The snow was tapering off now, the flakes becoming fine and dry. The clouds were breaking in the distance, and I could see the faint cold light of a moon that was trying to find its way through. I thought about the house in Connecticut one last time. I pictured it from the top of the hill. From that distance it would look small. The blinking blue and white lights would look like a toy. The grand legacy of Richard Scott would look like a tiny spark in a very large and indifferent dark. It was a small house. It was a small life. I had lived there for a long time, but I didn't belong there anymore. I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome, and now I was finally on the road to where I was meant to be. The house was a vanity project. My life was the real venture. We turned onto a private road. The gate was made of wrought iron, and it swung open with a slow, mechanical grace. We drove up a long path lined with ancient maples. And then there it was, the house. It was a massive structure of gray fieldstone, its windows dark and deep set. It looked like it had grown out of the ridge itself. It looked permanent. It looked honest. The driver stopped the car in the circle of the drive. The engine died, and the silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence you only find in the mountains after a storm. It was a heavy, peaceful quiet that seemed to vibrate in the air. We sat there for a moment, none of us moving. We were just breathing. We were just being. Arthur opened his door and stepped out into the cold. The crunch of his boots on the snow was the only sound in the world. Julian and I got out of the car. The air was incredibly cold, but it was dry and it didn't bite. It felt like a tonic. I stood there and I looked at the house. It was a big house, but it didn't feel oppressive. It felt like a vessel. It felt like a place where things could be made. I looked at the keys in my hand. They were cold, but they were mine. I looked at Julian and he was smiling. It was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and stayed there. We walked toward the heavy oak door. Arthur was already there waiting. He didn't say anything about the past. He didn't mention the company or the layoffs or the money. He just looked at the stars that were beginning to peek through the clouds. "It's a good night for a beginning," he said. I turned the key in the lock. The mechanism was smooth and heavy. The door swung open and the air inside was cool and smelled of wood and stone and time. I stepped over the threshold. I did not look back. I knew that when the sun rose, the world would be white, and the sky would be blue, and the air would be still. The morning would be quiet. It would be the kind of quiet that follows a war. It would be the kind of quiet that you can build a life on. I closed the door and I heard the latch click. It was a good sound. It was the only sound I needed to hear. I was Teresa Scott, and I was home. The engine of the car hums as the last lights of the family home fade into the winter mist, leaving the past behind for a life built on integrity. If you found satisfaction in Teresa's journey toward freedom, please consider subscribing and liking the video. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on the ending. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.